The meals of King Henry VIII of England were among the most fantastic dishes ever created.
Henry VIII was the gourmet of his time. He was the great foodie.
Henry consumed meals of bizarre meats like dolphin and songbird and enjoyed intricate puddings moulded from sugar. Based on astrology as much as taste, Tudor food included elaborate jellies made of deer antler, even alcoholic spirits flavoured with pure gold.
Well, it has been conjectured that most people in Tudor times were drunk most of the time.
From their great palaces, the Tudor monarchs were served extravagant meals that combined the outrageous with the everyday, helping to shape the way we eat and taste right up to the present day. As we journey back in time to the 16th century, we'll discover the secrets of royal cuisine and reveal a meal fit for a king. Henry VIII lived in a period of profound change in European food. While Portuguese merchants were bringing back exotic spices from the Far East, Spanish conquistadors were sending home strange new vegetables and animals from their New World conquests, and inspired by Renaissance Italy, courts all over Europe were adopting refined table manners and etiquette. Caught in the centre of this tide of change was England, and its ruling dynasty, the House of Tudor, its most famous ruler, King Henry VIII. Best remembered as the king with a record 6 wives, Henry was a big monarch with an even bigger appetite.
Most people have seen the film of The Private Life of Henry VIII, and they can see him grabbing his chickens, tearing them apart and flinging spare bits over the shoulder for the dogs. It wasn't like that at all. Tudor meals were served with tremendous formality.
The kingdom Henry ruled over was also very different from the crude stereotype. The Tudor world was one of beauty and refinement, where clothes, music, and especially food reached new levels of luxury and perfection.
The thing we've got to stress about Tudor food is this. The Tudors lived in the most lovely houses. Even the poor lived in charming houses. They wore beautiful clothes, wonderful embroidery. Even low people actually took a lot of trouble over their clothes. Their art was beautiful. Their furniture was wonderful. Their music was divine. But we all think their food is rubbish. But that's not true. They ate extremely well. And if you follow the recipes properly, the Tudor meal is very, very good. Very good indeed.
I don't think Britain had actually seen so much food, so much money spent on food, and such gargantuous amounts of food since the Romans.
In fact, what Henry ate has changed the way we eat today. Sugar imported from the New World, spices from the Far East, and strong alcoholic spirits from Arabia.
It was the biggest food revolution in the history of mankind. Our diet, really, has been governed by those extraordinary discoveries in Henry VIII's time.
From magnificent palaces like Hampton Court, Henry's cooks created dishes for over 800 servants and courtiers and pushed the culinary arts of roasting and pudding making to unheard of new heights.
It is so different from the world of the ordinary person. It's even greater than the difference between, say, the ordinary lives of most people and the lives of a A-list Hollywood star today. The difference is even greater than that.
Renowned for their adventurous palate, nothing was safe from the ravenous Tudor appetite.
To a modern ecologist, one of Henry's meals would have been an absolute disaster.
Anything that stood still long enough to be caught, they would eat.
While ordinary folk survived on a type of vegetable stew, Henry dined on the rarest cuts of meat in the kingdom. Served course after course, Henry's dishes mixed sweet with sour, much as Chinese food still does today.
Tudor food frequently is sweet and sour. Now, we have no hesitation to eat sweet and sour pork in a Chinese restaurant. And you've got to look at it like that.
They'd always be willing to try different flavours, and there's always this thought that it was the rotting meat or the foul smells around that made us put spices in. It was nothing to do with that. We liked the taste of spices. Still do now.
Like the Chinese, the Tudors regarded everything they ate as being connected to the zodiac, So food was about more than mere nutrition. It was about astrology and medicine. This obsession with medicinal food manifested even in Tudor pudding. Candies were so highly prized they were kept under lock and key. Liquors were filled with precious gems and metals to prolong Henry's life. And the king would also feast upon fabulous, sometimes enormous, models made of icing sugar.
Before the Tudors, I mean, the only sweet substance we had in this country was honey. And villagers had honeybees, they kept bee bowls in which they kept bees. They didn't have sweet substances. It was an incredibly rare taste. It was a special treat, a sweet taste. The Tudors got so fond of it, it became an everyday taste, particularly in court circles, particularly with Henry, and particularly with all of his children. They loved sugar. The amounts of sugar that were going into the royal palaces were phenomenal. There were wagon loads of it going in, and it was incredibly expensive.
An ancient craft still performed for British royalty today, sculpting sugar has evolved into a fine art.
These flowers are made up from what they call flower paste. They can get it as thin as a butterfly's wing.
All these foods were prepared, processed and produced in the kitchens of Hampton Court, just one of Henry's 5 palaces. Here, Henry sat at the top of a mammoth food chain that consumed vast quantities of food. A demand for fresh produce that could exhaust local supplies in a matter of weeks. Such overindulgence would eventually turn Henry into the enormous monarch we're all familiar with. Yet, when Henry had come to the throne at the age of only 17, he was a very different man.
He was 6'2", which is reasonably tall even today, but was certainly very tall in the 16th century. He had red gold hair. He had a very powerful build. And he was also incredibly proud of his legs. You have to bear in mind that in the 16th century, it was the gentlemen who showed off their legs rather than the ladies. So a good pair of legs, particularly a well-developed calf, was the kind of thing that could definitely turn heads in the 16th century.
Henry's turbulent reign would be characterized by great religious conflict, but it laid the seeds of future glory. By the time of his daughter, Elizabeth I, England was not just a cultural centre that boasted Shakespeare's Globe Theatre. It was a country on its way to becoming a maritime empire that would help change the eating habits of the world. During Henry's reign, a typical day at Hampton Court Palace began at 5 a.m. The first task of the day was baking. In 16th century England, bread was an absolute staple of everyone's diet. It came in numerous varieties according to the grade of flour and was often sweetened with currants and dried fruits.
The king's bakers would be working flat out because he had a huge household to maintain, not just people who worked in the kitchen, but the whole palace and lots of hangers-on. So the royal bakers would be working extremely hard, and I believe at times they actually had to buy in bread from other bakers.
After baking for an hour, the first bread would be ready, though not for eating. The Tudors believed that freshly baked bread gave you heartburn and always left it a day before eating. Servants received hard wholemeal bread, while the king and his nobles dined on soft white rolls called manchets. A bread roll would be served to Henry for his breakfast, along with cold meats and a goblet of ale. This unusual medieval custom of drinking alcohol first thing in the morning was born of necessity. Most water simply wasn't safe enough to drink. Unlike many English aristocrats, who regarded early mornings as the preserve of those unfortunate enough to have to work for a living, Henry often rose early. Not to work, but to play sport or go hunting, his life's greatest passions. Elsewhere in the palace, in the dairy, work had begun churning the milk curd. Dairy products formed an important part of the Tudor diet, especially for those who could afford it. Butter was churned in wooden vats, then by hand before being separated from the buttermilk.
It's a very tricky process because if the weather's too hot, the butter won't come properly, it just melts. If it's too cold, it won't come because it just won't beat up.
Finally, the butter was beaten with paddles to rid it of any excess moisture. If it was bound for the king's table, it would then have been treated with particularly special attention. Carefully crafted into a mould to delight and amuse the eye of King Henry.
The dairy was actually the woman's preserve, and it was a tradition that the profits from the dairy were the woman's own to keep, so women had a particular interest in dairying.
Although women dominated the dairy, the kitchens were the domain of men, and setting out the ingredients for the royal meal began early in the day. Fresh garden produce from local villages, nuts and sour oranges from Seville, turkey, a rare delicacy first imported from Mexico in 1523, pheasant, rabbit and venison from the king's own estates, fresh salmon from the estuaries of Scotland, rare and precious spices from the Far East, and freshly butchered livestock supplied by the local nobility. Cooking these royal meals required an army of servants.
There might have been hundreds of people working, not just cooking the food, but preparing it, skinning it, butchering. People would have their job assigned to them, and they would have assistants, and there would be potboys and scullions to do the heavy, dirty work, the washing and carrying, preparation, that sort of thing.
Most of these hundreds of servants would be assigned to Hampton Court's Great Kitchen, a Renaissance canteen capable of feeding thousands that still stands today. More important nobles had their food produced elsewhere, in Henry's case, in his own private kitchen.
The king wanted to have his meals when he was ready for them, and not when the kitchen could prepare the food. So obviously a smaller kitchen could have food ready at any time of the day or night. And it was also a security measure because they were always absolutely terrified of poison at this time. And when you took up a job in the king's privy kitchen, you actually took an oath of loyalty to the king in person.
Although always on call, Henry's personal cooks usually aimed to have his main meal ready by late morning, because in the 16th century, that was when the main meal of the day took place. Evening meals would not become fashionable for another 200 years. Laying the king's table was an elaborate ritual with all the solemn overtones of a religious mass, including tableware made of solid silver. Traditionally, the first course prepared by the royal cooks was the Tudors' greatest speciality, spit-roasted meats. Roasting meat in its own juices with a light basting of rosemary oil produced a very tender and succulent meat, much lighter in texture and much less heavy in fat than meat roasted in modern ovens.
Spit-roasted food has a certain amount of smoke added to it, so it's not unlike barbecued food. And it's an arduous job for a spit boy or a turnspit to keep turning the spit and basting the meat so that it cooks evenly.
The flavour is much better. You know, it's succulent, it's luscious, it's completely different from meat baked in an oven. We no longer roast meat, we bake it. There's no such thing as a Sunday roast. We should say the Sunday bake.
So popular was spit roasting that during the reign of Henry's father, specially trained dogs had been taught to turn the spits. During Henry's own reign, the technology of English spit roasting changed once more.
Spit roasting was really the art of the English cook. The French cook envied the skills that the English had at roasting. The English had an intuitive feel for the fire, which was extraordinary, and they also had the most advanced technology for roasting. Very early on, they adopted an Italian invention, the girarosto, or the spit jack, which rotated the spit. It's the first robot in the kitchen. It replaces that poor little boy who swatted away hour after hour, turning the joints in front of the fire, and actually did a much better job.
But spit-roasted beef, lamb, pork and poultry were only the more familiar meats of a range that could include anything from seals to songbirds. Not surprisingly, many other Europeans found English food horrifying.
The Tudor Elizabethan cooks were the mavericks of their day. There was absolutely no limits on anything they tried.
They would eat herons, rooks, small singing birds, things which we would be quite horrified at. They would eat seals, porpoises, whales if they got them.
I know there's one particular dish which was always on the table when diplomats came, and it was whale's tongue. Can you imagine that? Porpoise, peacock, birds repeatedly stuffed with other little birds on tables. One dish which really would have all the sort of health authorities up in arms at the moment, and that would be you peel off the peacock's feathers and skin from the bottom up to its head. You roast the peacock, then you pull the skin back on, take it into the banqueting hall.
In fact, the Tudors believed the rarer the animal, the more likely it was to have special health-enhancing qualities. Henry hunted such rare animals to near extinction on his royal estates, but Henry's infamous reputation is based on the most consuming hunt of his life.
What do you want?
Your Majesty, it's a boy.
What?
The pursuit of a male heir.
It's a boy!
Although Henry VIII is perhaps most famous for having had 6 wives, in reality he was not quite the virile male many have always assumed. In fact, Henry's many marriages were the consequence of a very different sort of desire.
The fact he kept marrying was really this desperation for a son. After all, if a king wants just plain sex and a good time, he's got most of the ladies of the court at his disposal. He doesn't have to marry them. Having an affair with the king doesn't do anybody's career any harm in the 16th century.
But if the idea of Henry as a serial philanderer is a myth, one cliché is certainly true. The king loved his food. And this love affair usually began around 11 a.m. when minstrels would herald the main meal's readiness. The king usually ate alone, separate even from his wife, but he was never on his own, and at all times he was surrounded by his favourite courtiers and servants. Served in his private chambers, dining for Henry was very much like a religious mass. The first part of the ceremony was to offer the king bread and wine. Henry usually drank a sweet red wine, and his bread was always a white manchet roll. He would be cut the top half, giving us the origin of the expression upper crust, meaning high class. Presented with each dish in turn, Henry would select from a first course of up to a dozen dishes, all of which had been presented to him. Roasted chicken served up on a platter of fennel and herbs. A large saddle of spit-roasted lamb. Fresh salads served with highly prized Seville oranges from Spain, or adorned with rose petals and marigolds, edible flowers that were a Tudor favourite. Roast turkey, an exotic delicacy imported into Europe from the Spanish colonies in America. A sweetmeat pie surrounded in figs, and a selection of vegetables including carrots and artichokes. A first course dominated by spit-roasted meats that were the Tudor speciality. These would be served by Henry's own master carver, whose skills were highly prized by 16th century royalty.
Every joint, every bird, every fish was carved in a particular way, and there were names to describe these different ways. So even when you sliced up an egg, you tired an egg. When you carved a pike, you splatted a pike. And when you carved a swan, you lifted a swan.
Today, the art of the master carver still survives in Simpson's, a traditional carvery in the heart of London.
The carvers that we have in Simpson's learn from one of the more senior carvers. Again, it's very much to do with practice. its confidence. At the end of the day, the carver is also putting on a show.
Cutting techniques vary from joint to joint. When cutting a saddle of lamb, a small knife with a pointed end is used to make a deep incision along the backbone. A cut is then made along the rib cage, allowing thin slices like rashers of bacon to be removed from the joint.
The art of carving was a great honour, especially in the monarch's court. And for a carver, it should be an extension of the arm. You shouldn't actually feel the knife at all.
When carving turkey, the carver must first remove the leg or drumstick so that the breast is exposed. An undercut is then made just above the thigh so that the whole area, or face, is clear to carve.
So what you're trying to do with carving technique is follow the actual structure of the animal to help you carve more professionally, produce a better quality finish on the plate.
Carving a rib of beef requires first removing the layer of fat it has been cooked in so that the meat beneath is exposed. Then clear, vertical cuts can be made straight down to the rib cage, producing thin slices of tender meat.
Thinness is important. I mean, medieval times, obviously, the quality of dentistry and the quality of teeth was pretty poor. If it was cut too thickly, it would most probably result in the lord of the manor or the monarch's teeth disintegrating and the carver being a very unpopular individual. In more modern day, we've found that if you actually cut it thinly, you actually enjoy the flavour much more quickly than if it's a large, thick piece.
But carving unusual joints of meat has now become a rarity.
We have had a bit of fun with someone where we challenged them to carve a quail and presented it on one of our trolleys to lift the dome, and there was this little bird here. Dishes such as swan you just don't get hold of, or peacock. It's just a dish you don't see in England anymore.
Henry VIII's master carvers were confronted with some bizarre carving challenges. Not least because the Tudor obsession with meat encompassed every part of the animal.
Curiously, cuts of meat like pig's trotters and sheep's trotters and offal, intestines and even testicles were things which Tudors really enjoyed eating.
In fact, the Tudors were so fixated with meat, the word vegetable didn't yet exist. Instead, vegetables were separated into worts, beans, potherbs and salads. Most of these would still be familiar to us today, with one notable exception, the potato. A vegetable that would not reach England from America until the time of Henry's daughter Elizabeth I, potatoes did not become a popular food until the 18th century. The vegetables actually eaten by Henry depended largely on what could be grown locally, and most crucially of all, the season.
The seasons in the 16th century were all important. You couldn't eat food out of season. Now we can fly asparagus in from South America, you know, in the middle of winter, when in the past you would only have it for about 2 weeks in the spring. And the flavour of an apricot in the late summer was something that maybe just lasted for 10 days.
We are so lucky nowadays with convenience foods, 15 seconds in the microwave, whereas in the past, cooking involved it right from the ground, right from the root. You'd have to grow the vegetables, you'd have to look after them, you'd have to cut them, take them into the kitchen, wash them, prepare them. And there was an awful amount of energy, a lot of people involved in it, a lot of money involved.
But far more important and expensive than vegetables were Henry's seasonings and spices.
Henry VIII, he spent £4,000 in 1 month alone on spices, entertaining the King of France.
A sum equivalent to millions of pounds today, it was a cost only matched by sugar, a substance which would revolutionise all areas of Tudor cooking, eating and drinking. Ever since the dawn of European civilization, spices had been imported into Europe from the Arab world. Strong seasonings were a favourite of the English nobility, who also had a particular fondness for sweetening foods, adding sugar beet even to such unlikely foods as roasted meat.
it's now become more fashionable to have things without sugar. So dry wine is much more fashionable than sweet wine, whereas in Tudor times the sweet wines were more expensive and therefore more prestigious.
To help with his digestion, Henry would have had a goblet of sweet wines. During the 16th century, vast quantities of alcohol were consumed because of the unsafe water. At Hampton Court, even the lowliest servants had an allowance of 6 pints of beer a day.
Well, it has been conjectured that most people in Tudor times were drunk most of the time.
The big problem was that the water just wasn't safe to drink. So the safest thing to drink was beer or ale, and that's what most people drank all the time.
Ignorant of the secrets of bottling, Tudor wine had to be drunk fresh, and Henry had a particular taste for medicated wines.
Henry was a terrible hypochondriac, and even though he was so fit and healthy for most of his life and was the kind of man who adored physical exercise, he was actually always worried that he was going to come down with something.
A recipe for one of Henry's medicated wines has been discovered by food historian Ivan Day.
It's called Hippocras, and it's a spicy digestive medicine, really, that was intended to help the king get through the night.
In it would go rare spices from the Far East, grains of paradise, which gave the drink a chili-like flavour, long pepper and tailed pepper for the digestion, cinnamon for sweetness, cardamom to prevent flatulence, galangal, now used in Thai food, and rosemary to help the heart. The final ingredient was a good French Bordeaux.
All we need now is to wait 24 hours for our spices to steep.
After maturing, the mixture was then put through a strainer called a sleeve of Hippocrates, from which it gets its name.
And all that remains to be done now is to pour some Hippocras, and of course to drink some. Very sweet, very spicy, a little bit medicinal, but that's what it was for. It was to allay Henry VIII's indigestion. It is in fact the ancestor of our modern mulled wines.
Having drunk Hippocras to guard against flatulence and heartburn, Henry's first course would now come to an end. Leftovers were distributed amongst his courtiers and the poor, the most prized waste in the kingdom. At this point, Henry often paused in his meal. An accomplished musician, Henry is thought to have composed several traditional tunes from the period.
Henry did play the lute, and in fact he seems to have either done some composing himself or to have done settings for common tunes of the time. So he was a man who certainly appreciated music and was a very fine dancer as well.
And when the king stopped, so did his servants. And if they were lucky, they might themselves have enough time to eat. Invariably, they ate pottage, a thick broth made of whatever was available, butter beans, dried peas, and yesterday's leftovers.
The poor had a very monotonous diet. It was largely pottage, which is a sort of thick vegetable stew, with bits of meat, a bone for flavouring perhaps, a bit of bacon if they could get it.
Fresh meat was only for the very rich. Everyone else boiled joints of salted meat that had been preserved over the long winter months.
Salting was very important in that the main source of meat for ordinary people was their pig, and that would be killed November time, and that way of course you didn't have to feed it over the winter, and you would salt it down, use it for the rest of the year.
Servants of Henry VIII would be lucky enough to eat salted meat every day, sharing one small joint of salted pork or beef between every 4 staff. It would have been served with pottage on a trencher, a plate literally made of bread. Eating implements were the spoon and the knife, the same whether you were a king or a peasant. The fork had still not caught on.
In 16th century post-Reformation England, the enemy was Italy, and the fork was an Italian invention, and the English looked down upon it.
Table manners were important even to the lower orders. Only the left hand could touch communal dishes. The right was used for cutlery or to feed the mouth. Cleanliness, especially for Henry's cooks, was crucial.
They are actually quite clean. You know, we always think the Tudor kitchens would have been foul, but there were drains made, and, you know, they used to perfume everything so there wasn't foul stenches. So they were very clean people.
Meal times for the kitchen staff were short-lived. They had to be ready to serve Henry's next course as soon as the king wanted it. A second course, which included the fast food of the 16th century, the pie.
Partly because making pies was a way of preserving food. If you wanted to take food for a journey, the best way to preserve it was in a pie, because it would have lots of meat jelly and lots of fat that would surround the meat. The pastry would surround all that, keep the air out, and you could probably keep them for 2 or 3 weeks.
The pastry was really just a way of preserving the contents, so you didn't necessarily eat the pastry. You could just eat the inside out of the pie.
One favourite pie dating from Henry's time is still cooked in parts of England today, Stargazy pie. It's made from sardine-like fish called pilchards that most of us would find very odd today.
Stargazy pie is a dish which comes from the West Country in truth, but it would be made in a great deal of places. Recipes travelled quite quickly. Ladies of a great house would go to another great house, find something interesting and being cooked, and ask for the recipe, bring it home, and teach their own cooks to make it.
Whether Henry enjoyed Stargazy pie, no one knows. He certainly ate stranger foods.
Slits are made in the pastry top, and the pilchard's heads poke through, and then the whole thing is baked so that you've got these pathetic little faces looking at you as you eat them.
Another of the ingredients for Henry's pies he frequently hunted himself, close to Hampton Court Palace in Richmond Park. A herd of these royal deer still roam here today. Venison was a popular ingredient with Tudor pie makers. Simmered slowly with prunes and red wine, sautéed venison came fresh from the king's estates. Pies also allowed the Tudors to indulge in another of their favourite culinary pastimes, elaborate dishes of disguised foods called deceptions. Making something appear to be something else was a much admired skill in Tudor cooking. Pies made to look like castles or chickens stitched together and decorated to look like a strange lizard were great favourites.
The Tudors had a great sense of humour, perhaps a childish sense of humour, and they frequently enjoyed eating food which was disguised. It was something pretending to be something else. For instance, there's one late Tudor food writer who tells us to make a full meal out of blancmange. And there's one very famous account of a visitor to the Tudor court who remembers a very similar meal being completely made out of jelly. And this is something which gets developed in the 17th century and the 18th century, where people start moulding things out of ice cream.
Deceptions were commonly prepared for Henry's second course, which also traditionally contained fish. Salmon stuffed with leeks was one popular choice when the season was right. During the 16th century, food was brought to the table in 2 stages, like 2 buffets. Because fish could be cooked quickly, it made an ideal second course, as did cold meats and pies. Henry's second course would be served with all the pomp and ceremony of his first. But how much of these vast meals did Henry really eat?
Although they had these gargantuan meals, it didn't necessarily mean that everybody ate everything. Your meal was shown to you at the beginning. You saw the dishes paraded in front of you, and you decided what you liked the look of and what you were going to eat.
Enormous amounts of food were at least put on the table in front of the king. I mean, amounts of food that he could not possibly eat in one sitting, although he was a good trenchman and enjoyed his food.
But as well as salmon and more joints of meat, Henry also ate quiche. Tarte de brie, a quiche made of slices of brie imported from France. An unlikely dish for the meat-loving Henry VIII.
It's good.
Henry also loved pastries, and one of his favourites can still be eaten today, a sweet pastry called a Maid of Honour.
A Maid of Honour is a puff pastry tart with a sweet curd filling. It's a Tudor recipe that was associated with Richmond Palace and, of course, Henry VIII.
According to local legend, the handmaidens of Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn, first introduced Henry to the little tarts.
The legend was that Henry came across a group of maids of honour, which are ladies in waiting, if you like. They were eating this particular tart. He asked what it was called. And they shrugged their shoulders. So he said, this should be called a Maid of Honour. And the unfortunate cook who'd put it together was from then on imprisoned within the palace grounds and had to produce this solely for Henry's table.
Passed down for centuries, the recipe has been in the possession of John Newen's family for well over 100 years, and he's not about to give away the secret now.
It is still a sort of family secret, so we don't tell you sort of all the ingredients. It's a little bit like a custard tart, maybe with coconut in. It's very sweet and very rich, but it's very, very nice. We can't eat too many, though. It's definitely not a healthy food, I'm afraid.
Extremely sweet foods were a great favourite of the Tudors, and 2 hours after he first sat down to eat, Henry now moved on to his pudding course. The Tudors were famous all over Europe for their outlandish puddings, and many of the sweet dishes they invented have survived right down to the present day. Exotic fruits imported from the continent. Sugar sweets called comfits. Jelly made from deer's horn and cow's trotters. A milk dessert mixed with cornstarch called blancmange that was coated in gold leaf. And a custard tart topped with pomegranate seeds.
Presentation was everything, and they went to enormous lengths to make even things that would seem mundane to us very special.
Spanish envoys at Henry's court reported that the most fantastic aspect of English pudding making was jelly, often made from the antlers of a male deer called a hart.
Hartshorn was the thing that you used for setting a jelly in those days, so you literally have to grate a hart's horn.
Everything had to look good. Even if it didn't always taste so good, it had to look spectacular.
In pursuit of the perfect gelatin colouring, Tudor cooks even used child's urine, an ingredient that supposedly helped turn it green.
Yeah, that's not bad.
Far tastier was another of Henry's favourite delicacies, sugared wafers, the great-granddaddy of the breakfast waffle.
Henry VIII wouldn't have been able to experience waffles because they were only known on the continent in the 16th century. But what was very popular in England at court was the wafer which you had after the meal. To make wafers, you need some wafering irons. They're very heavy and they get very, very hot over the fire, so this was quite a dangerous procedure. First of all, you open the irons and you anoint both the plates with a little bit of butter, and then, making sure the irons are absolutely square to the ground, you put the exact amount of batter, you really have to have some experience to get this right, into the centre. And then this is the magic bit. You close the irons very gently, and you get this wonderful whining noise with the smell of rose water and spices exuding out of the irons. Trim off the excess. There was a special office in the kitchen complex in the royal kitchens called a wafery, where the waferer, who was an officer who did nothing but make them, would make wafers. Right, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to roll the wafer off the iron, which is quite a dangerous job. It's quite hot. Right, a bit of a balancing trick. And that's it, perfect. Put it on there to cool down. Once it's hardened, it can be removed from the stick, and there we have a perfect 16th century rolled wafer fit for a king.
Although they took only 2 minutes to cook, sugar wafers were so precious they were kept under lock and key, a biscuit only for the king and his favourites. As his meal drew to an end, Henry would begin to eat foods that would aid his digestion. Most valued of all these digestive foods was cheese, a common food of the 16th century.
The big thing for ordinary people was trying to preserve milk for the winter, and that's one reason why cheese was so important. And cheese is a really good source of energy.
Cheese was just one of many foods the Tudors thought had healing properties.
I've got hundreds and hundreds of books that tell me about different herbs and different foods being healing foods, and I think now it's done a full circle, and we're nowadays looking back to how things have healed you in the past. What are the best foods for certain ailments?
Cheeses helped digestion by reputedly sealing up the furnace of the stomach, and like many other foods, cheeses had a significance far beyond their taste or nutritional worth.
They thought the stomach was a cauldron which fermented the food, and by taking cheese, which was astringent, this little seal at the top of the valve would close and the stomach could get on with its job of digestion.
Having lined his stomach with cheese, Henry could now embark on the final part of his meal, a course called the banquet, whose strong alcoholic spirits and sugar delicacies are without doubt the Tudors' greatest legacy.
The really rich, like the king in the 16th century, were beginning to get a taste for very, very strong distilled cordial waters or liqueurs, which were made in stills like this one here. These much richer and ardent spirits were frequently flavoured with many, many different spices. The two I've got on this plate are destined for a drink fit for a king: licorice and red Sanderswood. Some of these drinks frequently had the most exotic ingredients in them. For instance, in a drink fit for a king, Royal Escobar, you would have to put gold leaf. The first spirits that we have, we've got very good directions of how to make them, so we can replicate them exactly. After 14 days maturing in the cellar, the Escobar is now ready to sample. It really is delicious, very rich, very spicy. I can't say I can taste the gold. This was the very drink that Henry would have finished his meal with, usually with a wafer. This is really the equivalent of our liqueur and our chocolate mint at the end of our modern dinner party. Delicious.
Gold was thought to aid longevity, and the supposedly medicinal drinks to which it was added soon became an essential part of any banquet.
They thought it was the pearls and the gold that was having this effect on them. They didn't realise, in fact, it was a good old Arab alcohol that was doing the trick.
Having finished his liqueurs and sugar sweets, Henry's main meal was finally over, having lasted perhaps 3 hours. 400 years later, thanks to Henry, we not only have a taste for liqueurs and sugar, but roasted and barbecued meats, spices, even the humble pie is as popular today as it ever was. With its heavy reliance on meat and sugar and lack of vegetables, Henry's diet would not be regarded as very healthy today, and almost certainly contributed to the illness and infirmity that marked his declining years.
Oh,
Henry, you know you can't digest it.
Henry's diet would have included too much meat by modern standards. And although they did eat some things in the way of fruit and vegetables, it wouldn't be your 5 portions a day that we're recommended to eat these days.
Ironically, Henry may have lived longer if he'd eaten his servants' food.
Very little meat went into the diet of poor people. So in many ways it was possibly a healthier diet than those of the rich, who didn't have very much in the way of vegetables at all.
Born in 1491, Henry died in 1547. He was 57 years old. All his efforts to sire a male heir came to nothing. His eventual successor was Elizabeth I. During her reign, yet more foods arrived from the Americas, like chocolate and tomatoes. So far from being medieval throwbacks with a terrible sense of hygiene and bad teeth, the Tudors cooked and ate with great elegance, establishing the beginning of modern table manners, introducing new foods, and inventing marvellously innovative approaches to cooking. A legacy that is still part of the international world of cuisine today.